Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
So glad you're with us for the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Hope you all had a very Merry Christmas, and hopefully if there are any gifts you need to return today, you're doing so surreptitiously. So the lovely person who got that for you, but you don't really want it, never finds out. Jim, I hope you and your family had a great Christmas, and as we continue now in our year-end award season, we're on to our third installment. I know it's been a busy holiday week, but back on Monday, we started with the most overrated, underrated, and honest political figures of 2024. On Christmas Eve, we talked about the figures we were most sorry to see go, pass away in 2024, as well as the rising star and the figure fading into oblivion. So now with our third installment, we're going to focus on the biggest lie of 2024. And in politics, there's no shortage of options there. And then the best political theater of the year and the worst political theater of the year. So, Jim, what is the biggest lie of 2024?
These are the bumper crop categories of our awards. It's very, some years like, who are you? Who is the best person? Who is the most honest person? Biggest lie. There's always a lot of intense competition. And I went with the one that I feel like has been the biggest lie really for several years now, and probably the most consequential big lie we've seen, which is going back several years. And that is the argument that died around the middle of the year, the contention that Joe Biden's health is fine and that he could handle the duties of the presidency. There was nothing wrong or unusual about having an octogenarian president. He had so much energy that Karine Jean-Pierre can't keep up with him. Look, I've been writing about this. Some people would contend like a broken record for, a couple of years now, probably since Afghanistan. I wrote Afghanistan withdrawal debacle. I wrote a piece saying something is wrong with the president, looking at his public schedule. They kept saying how busy he was, and yet on the official schedule, he'd only had two calls to foreign leaders, was only doing events around the middle of the day. And this is building year by year, to the point where those of us were calling this out. Eventually, it became okay to write in places like the New York Times and Axios and Politico. Well, the president generally doesn't like to do events before 10 a.m. or after 4 p.m. So he's not really a 24/7 president. He's more of a 6'5" president. He could do 6 good hours a day, and that's considering how rarely we see him these days. Maybe it's even less than that. Enormously consequential, and that's the story of much of the 2024 presidential election. I think that a good chunk of the country elected Biden back in 2020, basically accepting him as a placeholder president. Back in 2019, Biden had already talked about being a bridge to a younger generation of Democratic leaders. I think the widespread assumption was that Kamala Harris was going to grow into the job and that she would be a serious presidential contender, and it never happened. Either out of his own ego, out of a lack of faith in Harris for whatever reason, or maybe because I think the 2022 midterms went better than expected for Democrats. Joe Biden convinced himself that he could keep doing this. I think Jill Biden and I think everyone around him believed that the country needed Joe Biden as the president. And they talked themselves into thinking this was a good idea. It was a terrible idea. It was always a terrible idea. Most people's bodies when they're 80s, you don't want to control the remote control, never mind the button. And so Biden, it became increasingly clear. Obviously, on the debate stage, it became too obvious. I was tempted to make that my nomination for Best Political Theater. I hope I'm not preempting your selection, Greg. I went in a different direction for that one. So again, it's a very sad story. There's something tragic about this, about the fact that everybody in the country could see this problem coming with a calendar. And yet there was just steadfast denial, not just by Biden, not just by the First Lady, but by everyone around them. And apparently by Kamala Harris, too. And as a result of it, a presidency that was in trouble pretty much from midsummer, if not earlier, of the first year, ends in, I think, disgrace. And I figure at some point in the next year, we're going to get all kinds of memoirs that will be saying, hey, as bad as you thought things were behind the scenes, things were much worse.
Yeah, and the media completely fueled this lie with, once the debate happened, it's like, oh, we've got these secret sources who are telling us that behind the scenes at fundraisers,
now it can be told.
Not as sharp as... We didn't need secret sources. We could watch the guy. He was mumbling and watch just his inability to articulate a sentence even as early as the Afghanistan debacle, or his snapping at George Stephanopoulos during that time, or the fact that nobody wanted him on the campaign trail during the midterms.
Greg, I was just saying to Helmut Kohl and Francois Mitterrand, both of them will testify. Ask them. Go ask them. misremembering the hurt. Like there was just one example after another of Biden remembering things that didn't happen, not remembering things that did happen. This is just not a guy who should be, commander in chief. And as we record this, he still is. Now, maybe by the time people listen to it, something will happen. But yeah, sleep tight, America.
Yeah. So after the better than expected midterms, could Pelosi, Obama, and everybody else gone to him then and convinced him not to do it? I doubt it, given where Jill and Hunter's own motivations lied at that time. But here's my choice. This is actually my first choice, although I did seriously consider Biden's age. Joe is fine is definitely one of the biggest lies of our time. But this is a story that's going to unfold in parts. This happened back in March. I think you were in Ukraine at the time, but this is something everybody's known about for a long time. Donald Trump is at a rally, and this is going to take about a minute to get the full context of this, but it'll make sense as we go on here. Here's what he says about the state of the auto industry.
Mexico has taken over a period of 30 years, 34% of the automobile manufacturing business in our country. Think of it, went to Mexico. China now is building a couple of massive plants where they're going to build the cars in Mexico and they think that they're going to sell those cars into the United States with no tax at the border. Let me tell you something to China. If you're listening, President Xi, and you and I are friends, but he understands the way I deal, those big monster car manufacturing plants that you're building in Mexico right now, and you think you're going to get that, you're going to not hire Americans, and you're going to sell the cars to us. Now, we're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars. If I get elected, now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it.
Get that? It's going to be a bloodbath as a result of China and Mexico doing the auto manufacturing. Within minutes, the left had this as the only clip from that statement.
Now, if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole. That's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it.
And so the media and the Democrats immediately turned it into this thing where Trump is promising blood running through the streets if he doesn't win in 2024. Nancy Pelosi, that same weekend.
He's even predicting a bloodbath. What does that mean? He's going to exact a bloodbath? There's something wrong here. How respectful I am of the American people and their goodness. But how much more do they have to see from him to understand that this isn't what our country is about?
That was March. September, we're at the debate. Kamala Harris is still pushing this.
And what did the president then at the time say? There were fine people on each side. Donald Trump, the candidate, has said in this election there will be a bloodbath if this and the outcome of this election is not to his liking.
Jim, you could have debated the tariffs. You could have debated a million things he probably said on social media that are kind of outlandish. It's very clear what he was talking about. And the lie not only perpetrated that weekend, it spread throughout the entire campaign. And there are still tons of people in the media pushing it and people on the left who want you to think that that's exactly what he meant.
Greg, that is an excellent selection, one that was widely overlooked. And I'll point out, I believe we are in December, and I believe that's the first time I've heard that full 90 seconds or so of what Trump was talking about immediately before he mentioned bloodbath and the context in which he's saying he's going to be an economic bloodbath. It's going to be very bad for the auto industry. So excellent choice. I will correct you. It's easy to slam Pelosi, Greg, but we probably should give her credit. When it comes to taking out guys who she thinks shouldn't be president, she was 1 for 2 this year, batting 500. So glass is half full, depending on your perspective.
All right, so we've covered the lies. Now it's on to the best political theater of 2024. Jim, what's at the top of your list?
So for a while, I was looking at the Trump-Biden debate, and maybe even the moment, and now when we finally defeat Medicare, as the kind of the moment of the year. But I feel like it was a little redundant. We discussed this. So I went with another, which I think, I hope I'm not stealing your idea, Donald Trump after the shooting. And not just the immediate moment where he gets back up and he pumps his fist and he tells the crowd to fight, fight, fight. He's got blood from the ear. Just, a remarkable moment. And I think if there was a sense of like this was a roller coaster and very tumultuous presidential election year, that was the moment where things got weird. That was the moment where things got strange. It was right before the Republican convention. Also, people forget, Trump had not picked J.D. Vance yet. He announced the pick of Vance like a couple of days later. But God forbid if that assassin's bullet had been just 1 inch over or just a little bit over, very well could have killed Trump, and you could have had a situation in which the nominee was not clear. Technically, Nikki Haley had come in second in votes, but it was still less than 20%. There'd be a question of who was the true successor to the Trump mantle. Within a few days, Vance, as running mate and now the vice president-elect, pretty clearly is in that role. I'm sure there probably will be a Republican presidential primary in 2028, but I think it's very likely that Vance will be seen as the successor. But that was moment, and I will extend this up for best political theater for the first 17 minutes or so of Trump's convention speech, because it showed us those sequence of events showed us something that Trump, for obvious reasons, never wants to look vulnerable on the national stage. And yet, I think it was a very humanizing moment. I think this is, probably the first time Trump really had to confront his mortality, unless maybe the COVID infection back in fall of 2020. And he talked about it. He talked about Corey, about the incident. There was just this humanity to Trump that really we just didn't get to see. And I think it was completely appropriate. I think it humanized him. I think it made a lot of people, it certainly made me kind of sit up and take notice and just kind of think about, he's in a situation that very few people have been in. And that probably makes the guy think about his legacy. It makes the guy think about what does he want to do. And he kind of acknowledged, and he wondered, the question of, did that, was God's hand in that? He talked about how he was looking at trying to gesture to the chart, and that if he had not turned his head to look at the chart, maybe things would have turned out completely differently. So just an amazing moment in American political history. And I think, Trump got a lot of praise, and I think he earned a lot of praise in those days. The fact that I'm referring to this first 17 minutes of Trump's political convention speech probably gives you a hint of where I'm going in the next category. But nonetheless, kudos to Donald Trump. I think it was the most, that's in a moment we'll be talking about for years to come.
I think that's obviously the most amazing political theater of the year. And by theater, it's not scripted or anything like that. This is just simply how he reacted.
We could just say, best political moment. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And so, you can have all the consultants to tell you how to deal with that, how to start an answer, like Kamala Harris starting every economic answer with growing up in the middle class. There are certain moments in a campaign that's usually not being shot, but sometimes it's on a debate stage, sometimes it's somewhere else, where you're just not going to be coached on what to do. And so then your instincts kick in. And we saw Donald Trump's instincts in that moment where I'm sure he was in shock to some extent. And then he's like, all right, let's get him on his feet. The shooter had been down. And the first thing he does, with the blood trickling down his ear, coming down his face, fist in the air, like you said, with the fight, so powerful that you literally had leftist media institutions not using it anymore because it was such a dramatic and defiant and pose. And so, yeah, I mean, at that point, I think even people who don't care for Donald Trump at all were impressed with that moment. I don't know how many of them changed their mind to vote for him at that moment, but it's a guy who, has tremendous resolve. He's a fighter. He always has been. But as always, I like to have a backup here. And one of my favorite best political theater moments that we've ever done is 2016 and the sobbing at the Javits Center when Hillary Clinton lost. And it wasn't quite like that for Kamala Harris for a few reasons. Number one, I don't think Trump winning was nearly as much of a shock this time as it was 8 years ago. Those people were there, at 5 o'clock for a victory party that they just knew was going to happen, and it never came. This time, they were nervous over there at Howard University. And instead of just, people sobbing, although I'm sure some of them were, they just kind of slowly trickled out from the lawn there at Howard University, especially after Cedric Richmond came out and said, she's not coming tonight, and still counting all the votes, but you knew they had lost. Meanwhile, over on MSNBC, they were not taking this well. And usually when a state is called or an election is called, in the Brett Baer style, it's like, okay, we're calling, in this case, Wisconsin. And with those electoral votes, Donald Trump is elected the 47th president of the United States. Historic moment, the only person to ever, besides Grover Cleveland, have 2 non-consecutive terms. And then you just kind of let that moment sink in. Maybe pan out to, a correspondent somewhere or something. Jen Psaki. Jen Psaki is at the desk, and for some reason, she, and not a news person, is delivering this august news that we have a winner in the presidential race. And here is how Jen Psaki rants on and on and on about Trump's win.
You've been predicting this. We've been waiting for it. And we do have some breaking news from the decision desk. NBC News can now project that Donald Trump has won the state of Wisconsin, which means he is the winner of this race and will return to the White House as this country's 47th president. And for so many of you watching right now, that news is, to say the least, a lot to digest. I understand that personally. After he lost 4 years ago, he refused to accept the outcome and incited a violent insurrection on our nation's capital. He's campaigned while facing criminal indictments related to his efforts to overturn the 2020 results, and he's run as a convicted felon. During this campaign, he has also promised to essentially be an authoritarian leader, to use power like no American president ever has before, and wield that power to go after his political enemies. This is a man who's also bragged about overturning Roe v. Wade and stripping away women's bodily autonomy. He's promised to conduct mass deportations to crack down on the rights of millions of Americans. Donald Trump is an anti-democratic force, but he's just been elected democratically in our country. And here's what might be the hardest part to hear, but we have to talk about and we have to say, and it is a hard part to digest for all of us. But we have to be honest about what we saw in this election. Donald Trump was elected by expanding his support over a number of key groups.
Cry harder, MSNBC. We know you wanted the historic moment of Kamala winning, but for goodness sakes, just report the news and then bounce it around the table. Psaki was clearly ready for this moment, and her litany of grievances just never seemed to end. But the schadenfreude was quite good.
You almost wonder, she's saying this into the camera and waiting for people to rush to polling. Wait, I want to change my vote. I didn't realize all that stuff. I'm only learning now about all these things about Donald Trump. Before we move on to the next category, Greg, we probably should mention something I thought you were going to go with, and obviously this is an excellent selection, but we really should not go without being mentioned. Donald Trump at McDonald's.
Yes.
Hilarious. Yes. When Trump was on Saturday Night Live, he did a sketch in which he played a janitor and somebody else was impersonating him. And it just seemed like something kind of hilarious. I hope listeners got a chance to see the AI generated image of everything going wrong and the kitchen getting on fire and him spilling drinks and all that stuff. But in reality, there was just something very fun, and it gave a testament. Something like 1 out of every 8 Americans, some extremely high percentage of Americans have at some point worked at McDonald's. And they have this kind, or worked in some fast food restaurant like that. And it's not easy work. It's not fun work. It's generally work you can do with minimal training, and that's why teenagers end up doing it a great deal. But there was kind of this salute to it, and it was funny. And of course, seeing people driving up the drive-through, and Donald Trump is handing you your Big Mac and your fries and all that stuff. And it was just another great, funny, humanizing moment, and one that just kind of that was perhaps a bit more in terms of a stage,
Yes.
political event. That strong contender for best political theater of 2024.
Oh, that was fantastic. Yeah, that was definitely on my list. The apron over the red tie, chatting it up with all the people coming through the drive-thru, and you got the media and the liberals saying, well, they screened. It was all Trump supporters. Well, yeah, it was. And so, but it's still. It's
funny they would do that after the assassination attempts.
Yes, exactly. And it was all because they couldn't prove Kamala had actually worked at McDonald's. They milked that all the way. And then before you know it, he was in a garbage truck after Joe Biden's comments. So, yeah, that was a fantastic moment. So, yeah, a lot to choose from in the area of good political theater for 2024. All right, Jim, you've foreshadowed it, I think. So what is your worst political theater for 2024?
Well, actually, this is a last-second change. I was ready to go with saying the best political theater included Trump's first 17 minutes of the convention speech, and the worst political theater was the remaining hour and a half, he just read, when you're a reporter at the convention on press row, generally they hand you first excerpts, and then once the president or the nominee starts speaking, they give you the transcript. It was a perfectly well-written speech. I wish the president had. By the way, when you win the election, in retrospect, every decision you make looks right. Every mistake you make looks inconsequential. I still think Donald Trump would have done himself a bigger favor if he had delivered the speech as written. It was a perfectly good speech. Trump likes to do the weave, as he says, whatever pops into his head. He likes to segue. And that's how he started talking about the odds of success of the Green Bay Packers in the middle of his discussion of the great state of Wisconsin. And I think it just weakened, as I said, first 17 minutes were awesome and powerful. And then it just kind of started to meander and lost the power. But I kind of feel like, now that I think about it, the other side in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention, being there for the first night and knowing that this was the night that Joe Biden was going to speak, that Joe Biden was going to address the country as the nominee, for the last time from a national convention, presumably. And as you recall, Greg, everybody got to speak before Joe Biden, and he spoke at this ludicrously late hour. Traditionally on the East Coast, you want it to be between 8 and 11, right? That's 11 o'clock. That's when the 11 o'clock news goes on. You wanted your main speaker of the night to finish at like 10:59, then switch over to the local news for the affiliates. Well, they didn't do that, and I can't remember exactly what hour. It was around midnight. It was late. Now, we all know Joe Biden doesn't like late nights to begin with, and you just had this circumstance in which it was clearly one last insult from the party of putting him as late as possible so as few people as possible would see it, and just kind of this shunting off into the attic. Where we used to keep the crazy ants, as H. Ross Perot used to put it. The Democratic Party was embarrassed by Biden. It was an insult to him. And I just think the sheer ugliness of it all was a demonstration. I'm going to make that my nominee for the worst political theater of 2024.
Yeah, that's a good choice. And Biden didn't do the DNC any favors either, because he got out there and it was clearly the speech that he was going to give. And then just a couple different spots, he's like, oh, yeah, and Kamala was there, too. There was no grand, soaring endorsement at all. It was just a angry defense of his own record, basically telling his own party, you messed up here. You never should have shoved me aside. And I'm sure he's still saying that now that Kamala didn't win the election. So I'm going to go to the courtrooms of New York City for my worst political theater of 2024. And the tortured logic behind two of the cases that found Donald Trump guilty this year, which seemed to be lawfare at its most rank. First of all, you had the Tish James Judge Engeron trial, the financial crimes trial, where there was no victim, nobody claiming that Trump defrauded them. He apparently, according to them, inflated the value of some of his assets. And because of that, even though, again, no aggrieved party, he was sentenced to civil damages of somewhere near $500 million. Ultimately, the appeals court knocked that somewhere in about half, but still a case that never needed to be brought and was only brought because Tish James hates Trump. But then you had Alvin Bragg, who tortured a misdemeanor into a felony past the statute of limitations in pretty much any normal rendering of the reading of that statute, related to the hush money and Stormy Daniels and all that. Got his 34 count conviction from the jury there. Trump was pretty much inevitable to get convicted in the Manhattan jury pool, and it certainly turned out that way as well. What happens to these cases now that he's president again? Looks like they're trying to come to some sort of conclusion to unwind it in the Bragg case. I don't know what Tish James is doing. She says she's not giving up on it. But in terms of, it's kind of like the lie with Trump. There are things you could find to push him on. I know Andy McCarthy thought the classified documents case had a lot more meat to it than these other cases. For example, that got dismissed by the judge, but he was out there for Fox. Andy was day after day talking about what a complete joke of a case this was, pushed by Alvin Bragg. Same thing with Judge Engeron. The prosecutors got what they wanted, except for a Trump loss in 2024. It's just an obvious case of lawfare in both cases. So it backfired, but it was definitely political theater all the way through.
A strong contender, Greg. I would salute that, and considering the developments towards the end of the year, one worth keeping in mind. Although, really, in the end, did Alvin Bragg get what he wanted? Congratulations, Alvin Bragg. You got the conviction of your life, and all it cost you was everything.
We'll see if it costs him his job next year. That would be something he definitely deserves to lose. So, Jim, tomorrow we move on to best and worst idea and boldest tactic from 2024. No shortage of nominees in those categories either. And that's how we'll wrap up the week. Next week, we'll get to our Person of the Year, Turncoat of the Year, Fearless Predictions, and all that stuff. Plus, our look at how the media failed us over and over again in 2024. But until then, have a great day. See you tomorrow.
Looking forward to tomorrow, Greg. See you tomorrow.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Please be sure to subscribe to the Three Martini Lunch podcast. If you don't already, tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play Three Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a great Thursday and join us again on Friday for the next Three Martini Lunch.